The war was ending, but the dying had not stopped. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing under its own weight. Allied forces were closing in from both east and west, Berlin was burning, and the Baltic Sea, once a busy artery of German trade, had become a graveyard. Amid the chaos, ships lay scattered in harbors from Lübeck to Kiel, loaded with refugees, soldiers, and something far more terrible. One of them was the Cap Arcona, a luxury liner built to carry the wealthy across the Atlantic. Now, streaked with rust and exhaustion, it waited quietly in the Bay of Lübeck. To the British pilots who would soon find it, the ship looked like a symbol of the German Navy's final desperation. They couldn't have known that its decks were crammed with thousands of emaciated prisoners pulled from concentration camps only days earlier. They couldn't have seen the hollow faces pressed against the portholes or the skeletal hands reaching for air through broken rails. The Cap Arcona appeared to be just another target in a sea filled with them. The story began weeks earlier, when Nazi authorities realized the war was lost but refused to surrender their prisoners. SS commanders issued frantic, conflicting orders. Some wanted to evacuate camps to keep witnesses from falling into Allied hands. Others demanded liquidation, a euphemism for extermination. The result was chaos, columns of prisoners forced on death marches toward the Baltic, driven through mud and snow by guards who no longer knew what purpose they served. In the last days of April, thousands from the Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg were herded toward the port of Lübeck. The guards told them they were being sent to Sweden for exchange or rescue. It was a lie meant to keep them moving. The Cap Arcona, once filled with chandeliers and polished decks, had been stripped bare. Rats ran through the cabins, and the smell of fuel and rot clung to every surface. Still, to those who had survived years of camps, the sight of a ship, any ship, seemed like a chance at salvation. They were forced aboard in groups, guarded by SS men with rifles. By early May, over 4,500 prisoners crowded its holds. Nearby, two other ships, the Thielbeck and the Athen, were also filled with human cargo. No one told the prisoners where they were going. Some believed they might yet be exchanged for German POWs, others whispered that they were being taken out to sea to be sunk deliberately. The latter were closer to the truth. On shore, the British Army was advancing fast. The German command wanted the evidence of the camps, these thousands of living ghosts, erased before liberation reached Lübeck. In the confusion, no one took responsibility for what would happen next. The ship stayed anchored offshore, waiting for orders that never came. Food and water ran out. Disease spread. The prisoners were trapped between two worlds, alive, but already marked by death. To the RAF squadrons preparing missions over the Baltic, intelligence briefings painted a different picture. They were told German naval units and SS personnel were fleeing by sea, possibly attempting to regroup in Norway. The ships off Lübeck Bay were labeled as enemy transports. The orders were clear: destroy all vessels in the area. And so, as May sunlight broke over the water, the Cap Arcona waited unknowingly for the final chapter of its story, a chapter that would turn one of the last battles of World War II into one of its most haunting tragedies. They came from everywhere, from Neuengamme, from Mittelbau-Dora, from subcamps scattered across northern Germany where death had long since become routine. In the last weeks of the war, the SS began clearing out the camps ahead of the advancing Allies. The guards called it evacuation, but to those inside, it was simply another death march. Prisoners staggered through bombed-out towns, their striped uniforms hanging in tatters, feet bleeding through wooden clogs. Civilians stared or turned away. Sometimes a farmer left a bucket of water at the roadside. Sometimes an SS man kicked it over. By late April 1945, the survivors, thousands of them, reached the port city of Lübeck. The harbor stank of fuel and smoke. German soldiers burned papers in the streets while refugees poured in from the east, desperate to flee the Red Army. Amid this chaos, the SS had found its last solution: the sea. The prisoners were told they were being sent to safety in Sweden, that Red Cross ships would soon carry them to freedom. It was a cruel, deliberate lie designed to keep them calm. The first to arrive at the docks saw the Cap Arcona rising from the gray water like a ghost. Once the pride of the Hamburg South America line, she had been a floating palace in her prime, grand staircases, velvet lounges, and shining brass railings. Now, after years of neglect and air raids, she was stripped bare, her hull scarred, her decks cluttered with debris. Her boilers no longer worked, she could barely move under her own power. But to the prisoners, starved and trembling, she was still a miracle of size and solidity, something vast enough to hold their exhausted hope. One by one, the columns were herded up the gangways. SS guards shouted orders, dogs barked, and the air filled with the stench of unwashed bodies. The ship's holds, once cargo bays, became prisons. Hundreds were crammed into each space, standing shoulder to shoulder, pressed so tightly that when one person fainted, they could not fall. Above deck, officers sealed hatches and posted guards. Those who tried to escape were shot and thrown into the water. Not all were Jews. Among the Cap Arcona's prisoners were Poles, Russians, Norwegians, Frenchmen, even Germans, political prisoners, resistance fighters, anyone the Nazis considered an enemy. The SS did not discriminate in those final days, they were simply clearing the record, erasing witnesses. Within days, two more ships nearby, the Lübeck and the Athens, were filled the same way. The harbor became a floating concentration camp. Conditions worsened by the hour. There was almost no food. Water came from barrels fouled with diesel and salt. Disease spread quickly in the holds, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia. Prisoners fought over scraps of bread, over a patch of air near the porthole. Some tried to carve messages into the wooden walls with nails or belt buckles, names, prayers, fragments of home. We were ghosts already, one survivor would later recall. We had lived too long in the world of the dead. Above them, the SS waited for orders that never came. No one in command could decide what to do. Some officers planned to scuttle the ships with the prisoners aboard, others wanted to use them as bargaining chips. But with every passing day, Allied troops drew nearer. British and Canadian units were only miles away, unaware of what floated just beyond the horizon. By the end of April, more than 7,000 people were imprisoned aboard the ships in Lübeck Bay. The Cap Arcona lay at anchor like a carcass on the tide, its once white hull streaked with soot. Those trapped inside could hear the gulls and the waves but not the world beyond. They did not know that freedom was only days away, or that death was closer still. The Cap Arcona lay still in the gray morning light, her mast silhouetted against a pale Baltic sky. The sea was calm, deceptively gentle, and the gulls wheeled overhead as if nothing below them mattered. Inside the ship, hell simmered. The air in the lower holds had grown thick and sour, every breath tasted of sweat, oil, and despair. Prisoners huddled together for warmth, though the days were growing warmer. Their skin clung to bone. Lice crawled across their necks and into their clothes. Some muttered prayers. Others stared blankly at the steel walls, too weak to move. Up on deck, SS guards patrolled with machine guns. They had orders to shoot anyone who tried to escape, though few had the strength to make the attempt. Beneath them, thousands of prisoners waited, not knowing that the men guarding them were just as uncertain of their fate. Germany was dying around them. The front had collapsed, Hitler was already dead. Every day, the thunder of distant artillery grew louder, rolling in from the west. By May 1st, the situation in Lübeck Bay had reached chaos. The port was clogged with ships, submarines, and wrecks, every kind of vessel the Germans could find. The British had broken through to the Elbe River and were preparing for the final push toward Denmark. Rumors spread among the SS that the Allies would soon arrive by sea. Some officers talked of surrender, others vowed to go down fighting. But one thing remained consistent: the prisoners aboard the Cap Arcona, Lübeck, and Athens were not to be released. Inside the ship, confusion turned to terror. The guards grew more brutal, drunk on fear and cheap schnapps. Some shot prisoners at random. Others abandoned their posts entirely, sneaking ashore to save themselves. The remaining SS men forced the captives to move from one deck to another, cramming them tighter as more arrived from smaller boats. No one knew why. The prisoners clung to the lie that they were bound for Sweden, though even that illusion was fading. Through the portholes they could see only German minesweepers and destroyers, the ships of a nation in collapse. Among the captives were people from every corner of Europe. French resistance fighters sat beside Polish priests. Soviet soldiers shared rations with Norwegians, Danes, and Dutchmen. There were Jews who had survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald, now trapped again within arm's reach of freedom. They spoke in dozens of languages, but fear needed no translation. On May 2, the British Army entered Lübeck. Allied soldiers found abandoned SS offices and empty prison camps. But the ships offshore were still there, anchored like ghosts in the bay. Reconnaissance pilots flying overhead photographed the vessels, noting their size and movement. To them, the scene looked like an evacuation of Nazi personnel. The Allies believed the ships carried SS officers fleeing north to Norway, where remnants of the German military were regrouping. That night, an eerie calm settled over the Baltic. From the deck, the prisoners could see the faint glow of fires burning inland. They could hear the distant rumble of engines, the British advancing closer. Some began to hope that rescue would come in the morning. They whispered to each other about the Red Cross, about freedom, about home. Others warned them not to dream. Hope, they said, was a dangerous thing. Just before dawn, a rumor swept through the holds: the SS were preparing to scuttle the ship. Men and women clawed at the hatches, shouting, begging for mercy. The guards laughed, but their laughter carried fear. They, too, had heard that British planes were coming. As the first light broke over the sea on May 3, the Cap Arcona drifted quietly in Lübeck Bay, her decks filled with thousands of the condemned. The war would end in days. For those aboard, it would end in fire. Morning broke clear and cold over Lübeck Bay on May 3, 1945. The water glimmered faintly, dotted with ships, gray silhouettes in a world that no longer knew who commanded it. The Cap Arcona drifted quietly among them, a massive, weary hulk surrounded by smaller vessels, the Thielbeck, the Athen, and a scattering of German minesweepers. On shore, the last remnants of the German Navy were in retreat. Most officers had already fled, leaving behind half-empty command posts and contradictory orders. To the British, the view from above told a different story. Pilots from the Royal Air Force's 2nd Tactical Air Force, Squadrons 184, 198, 263, and 197, had been briefed that morning. Their mission seemed simple: strike and destroy enemy shipping believed to be carrying escaping SS officers and troops bound for Norway. Aerial reconnaissance had confirmed a concentration of vessels in Lübeck Bay. Intelligence reports labeled them as hostile targets. None of the pilots knew that the decks below were packed with starving prisoners. By late morning, the squadrons were airborne from bases in northern Germany. The airmen flew Typhoons, fast, powerful fighter bombers armed with rockets and 20mm cannons. Each plane carried enough firepower to shred a ship in minutes. As they approached the bay, the pilots could see the black hulls below glinting in the sunlight, their decks crowded with figures. Through binoculars, it looked like soldiers milling about. To the British, it confirmed the target description. At 2:30 p.m., the first wave descended. The sound came like thunder, low, rolling, and inescapable. On board the Cap Arcona, the prisoners looked up in confusion. A few thought rescue had come. They waved towels and shirts, shouting hoarsely through the portholes. Then came the shriek of diving aircraft, the streak of rockets, and the first explosion. The blast tore through the upper decks, splintering wood and steel. Flames leapt into the air, black smoke billowing across the sky. Within seconds, panic erupted. The Typhoons came in waves, circling low, firing again and again. The Lübeck was hit next, then the Athon. The bay turned into chaos, a storm of explosions, fire, and screaming. Prisoners clawed at hatches and portholes, desperate to escape the inferno. Some leapt into the freezing water, the shock of the cold nearly stopping their hearts. Oil and fuel spread across the surface, igniting into sheets of flame. From the air, the RAF pilots could see the ships burning, but not what they were burning with. They saw small figures jumping, thrashing in the water, and thought they were enemy sailors abandoning ship. One pilot later recalled, "It looked like an evacuation. No one imagined civilians, let alone camp inmates." Within 20 minutes, the Cap Arcona was a floating torch. Her masts collapsed, her decks caved in, and the heat grew so intense that paint blistered off nearby vessels. The Lübeck capsized soon after, trapping almost everyone inside. A few prisoners who reached the water found it no safer. The sea itself was on fire. Those who survived the flames faced bullets. SS guards onshore fired at swimmers, fearing they might reveal the truth if rescued. By 3 p.m., the attack was over. The British planes turned north, their mission complete. Behind them, the bay was a landscape of smoke and wreckage. The Cap Arcona still floated, engulfed in flame, its hull glowing red in the afternoon sun. Survivors clung to debris, calling out in dozens of languages, French, Polish, German, Russian, but their voices were swallowed by the wind. The pilots would not learn what they had done until days later. The orders had been clear, the targets confirmed, the intelligence trusted. Yet in those 20 minutes, nearly 7,000 people had died, most of them prisoners who had survived the camps only to be killed in sight of liberation. The British thought they had destroyed the last remnants of the Nazi war machine. In truth, they had struck the final blow of the Holocaust. The bay burned long into the evening. Smoke hung over the water like a shroud, turning the sunset a dirty crimson. The Cap Arcona was no longer a ship but a skeleton, her hull still floating, blackened and broken, her decks reduced to ash. The air reeked of oil and salt and charred wood. The water around her shimmered with flame and debris. And in between the wreckage drifted bodies, thousands of them, bobbing in silence where waves had once carried laughter and music. For those who survived the initial assault, the nightmare had only begun. The Baltic in May was still lethal, the temperature barely above freezing. Prisoners who had leapt from the burning decks found themselves surrounded by walls of fire. Some tried to swim through the slick of burning oil, their clothes catching alight before the sea swallowed them. Others clung to wreckage, calling to one another in broken voices. Most would die within minutes from shock or exhaustion. On shore, a few local Germans saw the inferno unfold. Farmers and fishermen from nearby Neustadt and Lübeck stood helpless on the cliffs, watching the great liner burn. They could hear faint cries over the wind, pleas in languages they didn't understand. Some villagers launched small boats, hoping to help, but SS patrols stopped them at gunpoint. "No one approaches the ships," the guards shouted. "They are full of dangerous criminals." To disobey meant death. As dusk fell, the fire began to die down, leaving the Cap Arcona smoldering in the dark. Survivors floated for hours, half-conscious, drifting toward shore. A few who reached the beach were pulled from the water by local civilians, risking their lives to do so. Many of the rescued were too weak to stand. Their skin was blistered, their eyes glazed with shock. When asked who they were, most could only whisper one word: prisoner. By nightfall, the full horror began to surface. The Lübeck had sunk almost instantly, trapping thousands below deck. Only 50 people from her entire complement survived. The Athon, damaged but afloat, managed to save some of its passengers, but not many. Estimates would vary, but historians later agreed that around 7,000 men, women, and children died in the attack. It was one of the worst maritime disasters in history, greater even than the sinking of the Titanic. Yet, for days, few beyond Lübeck Bay even knew it had happened. The British forces who reached the coast the following morning were greeted by devastation. When they approached the shoreline, they saw the wreck of the Cap Arcona still smoldering offshore, her once elegant bow half submerged. The water was thick with oil and bodies. Soldiers waded in, pulling survivors to safety, stunned by what they saw. One officer wrote later, "They looked like skeletons in striped cloth, too light to be real." When the truth reached Allied command, disbelief gave way to horror. The RAF crews who had carried out the mission were devastated. They had followed orders, trusted intelligence, and done what every pilot in war must: strike before being struck. But nothing could erase the images of what they later learned, that the ships they destroyed were filled not with soldiers, but with the very people they had come to liberate. In Lübeck, the sea continued to deliver its grim harvest. For days, the tide washed ashore the bodies of men and women who had survived the camps only to die within sight of freedom. Local villagers buried them in mass graves along the dunes. British soldiers marked each with wooden crosses bearing the same inscription: "Unknown victim, May 1945." The Cap Arcona burned for 3 days before finally capsizing. Her nameplate disappeared beneath the water, ending the voyage of a ship that had once symbolized luxury and now embodied tragedy. The survivors who lived long enough to speak would call her the last camp of the Reich. For them, liberation had come dressed as fire from the sky. For 3 days, the Baltic refused to let go of its dead. The wind shifted, the smoke cleared, and the sea began to return what it had taken. The beaches around Neustadt and Lübeck filled with the bodies of the Cap Arcona's passengers, hundreds at first, then thousands. They came ashore tangled in seaweed and oil, their striped uniforms clinging to skeletal frames. Some still had their camp numbers stitched to their sleeves. Others wore scraps of civilian clothes, reminders of lives long since erased. British soldiers and local civilians worked side by side, pulling corpses from the surf. They wrapped them in sheets, blankets, anything they could find, and carried them to shallow graves dug along the dunes. The work went on for days. The men spoke little, the sight left them hollow. One British officer wrote in his diary, "We thought we had reached the end of horror when we entered the camps. We were wrong. The sea had its own camp to show us." Survivors, those few who had swum through fire and cold, were gathered in makeshift hospitals in Lübeck and Neustadt. Many were too weak to speak. Their bodies, starved for years and broken by burns or frostbite, began to fail even in safety. Doctors did what they could with limited supplies. Some survivors were so traumatized that they screamed at the sound of aircraft overhead, convinced another attack was coming. Others drifted into silence, staring at the walls with eyes that saw nothing. Among them was a Polish teenager named Marek, who had survived Auschwitz, Dachau, and now the Cap Arcona. When asked later what he remembered, he said only, "The sea was burning. The water burned." Another survivor, French resistance fighter Michel Hollard, described clinging to wreckage for hours before a fisherman pulled him from the water. "I was saved," he wrote, "but I could not understand why. It was as if fate had made a mistake." The British command quickly launched an inquiry. They discovered that the attack had been based on faulty intelligence. German officers had indeed reported a large number of SS personnel boarding ships in Lübeck Bay, but no one mentioned the prisoners below decks. Communication between Allied ground and air units had broken down. The result was a tragedy born of chaos, the last misfire of a dying war. Even after the truth was known, the disaster remained cloaked in silence. There was no victory to celebrate, no clear enemy to condemn. The RAF pilots were not blamed, they had followed their orders, but the survivors received little recognition either. In the grand sweep of history, the event was overshadowed by the jubilation of victory and the revelations of the concentration camps inland. Meanwhile, the sea continued its grim work. For weeks, more bodies washed ashore, sometimes miles away. Fishermen found them tangled in their nets. Children stumbled upon them while playing along the coast. Locals buried them in fields and meadows, marking graves with simple stones. The Allied authorities placed wooden signs at the beaches warning, "Do not swim. The waters are poisoned by death." By summer, only the wrecks remained. The Cap Arcona lay half-submerged, her hull jutting from the water like a broken spine. The Thielbeck had sunk completely, leaving an oil slick where she once floated. The bay was quiet again, deceptively peaceful, as if trying to erase what had happened there. But beneath the surface, the wrecks held thousands of souls, sealed in their iron tombs. For those who had seen it, the memory never faded. The prisoners had survived the worst of human cruelty, endured the camps and the marches, only to die at the hands of those who thought they were saving the world. It was a wound too deep for blame and too vast for words. In the final days of the war, when victory seemed inevitable, the Cap Arcona had given the world one last reminder, that even at the edge of peace, tragedy could still find a way to speak. The war ended a few days later. Across Europe, church bells rang, flags unfurled, and people filled the streets in tears of joy. But on the shores of Lübeck Bay, celebration never came. The sand was still black with oil, and the sea still whispered with the wreckage of the Cap Arcona. Soldiers who had dug graves by the hundreds stood apart from the cheering crowds. They could not forget what they had seen, and no victory could wash it away. In the first weeks of peace, the British military government took control of the region. They ordered the wrecks marked and the mass graves maintained, but the scope of the disaster was almost too vast to comprehend. Reports listed conflicting numbers: 4,500 dead, 6,000, maybe more. No one could be sure. The survivors were scattered across hospitals and refugee camps, most too weak to testify. Their stories trickled out slowly, fragmented by trauma and disbelief. Few outside northern Germany paid attention. The world was already overwhelmed by the liberation of Belsen, Dachau, and Auschwitz. One more atrocity, even one this large, faded beneath the weight of all the others. For decades, the Cap Arcona was remembered mostly by those who had seen her burn. Fishermen still found human remains in their nets. Rusted fragments of the ship washed ashore with every storm. Children in Neustadt grew up hearing warnings not to swim too far. "The sea is haunted," their parents said. Every May, the tide would bring new bones. Locals buried them quietly, sometimes without ceremony, sometimes with a prayer whispered into the wind. The survivors who lived long enough to speak tried to tell the world what had happened. A few gave testimony at war crimes trials, describing the forced boarding, the SS guards, the chaos of the attack. Their words were often met with silence. The RAF pilots were never blamed, their orders had been lawful, their intent justifiable. There was no villain simple enough to fit the story. History prefers clear lines, good and evil, victim and perpetrator, but the Cap Arcona belonged to the gray spaces between them. In the 1950s, salvage crews attempted to raise parts of the wreck. They brought up twisted steel, scorched wood, and the occasional relic, a shoe, a comb, a wedding ring fused by heat. The remains of hundreds more victims were discovered trapped inside the hull. Each time the divers surfaced, the same question lingered: what should be done with the ship that had become a coffin? The answer, finally, was to leave it where it lay. The Cap Arcona was declared a war grave. The sea would keep its dead. In the years that followed, memorials began to appear. In Neustadt, a small monument of stone and bronze was built near the beach where so many bodies had come ashore. It bore a simple inscription: Den Opfern der Cap Arcona, my 1945. To the victims of the Cap Arcona. Each year, survivors and locals gather there to lay flowers, their voices carried off by the wind that still smells faintly of salt and fuel. The tragedy of the Cap Arcona has no easy moral. It was not a battle, nor a crime of clear intent, but a collision of chaos, ignorance, and cruelty, a final echo of the war's madness. It reminds us that even liberation can bring devastation, and that truth in war is often buried beneath layers of misunderstanding and silence. Today, the bay looks serene. The water is blue, the beaches clean. Tourists walk where soldiers once dug graves, unaware of what lies beneath their feet. But for those who know the story, the calm surface hides something sacred. Beneath the waves rest thousands who outlasted every horror only to be claimed by one last mistake. Their silence is the final chapter of the Second World War, an unfinished one, written not in glory, but in sorrow. The sea has a long memory. Even decades after the guns fell silent, Lübeck Bay continued to whisper the story of the Cap Arcona. Fishermen still found fragments of her in their nets, bits of twisted metal, scorched wood, even the occasional bone polished smooth by salt and time. The water that once boiled with fire and oil had turned blue again, but it was a quiet blue, the color of forgetting. For those who lived through it, though, forgetting was impossible. In the post-war years, silence hung over the tragedy. The British, embarrassed by what had happened, avoided public discussion. The Soviets, who occupied part of northern Germany, had little interest in sharing a story that did not fit their narrative of victory. Even the survivors were scattered across a Europe struggling to rebuild itself. Some found homes again, others wandered between refugee camps, nameless and displaced. The Cap Arcona slipped through the cracks of history, its name surfacing only in local papers and the memories of those who could not escape it. But memory has a way of surfacing. In the 1960s, researchers began collecting testimonies, accounts from pilots, officers, and survivors. The truth emerged piece by piece: the SS orders, the forced boarding, the mistaken attack. It was not a single crime but a chain of them, linked by confusion and indifference. Each decision, every lie told to keep the prisoners calm, every message that never reached the RAF, had pushed the tragedy closer to inevitability. The survivors who spoke did so not with anger, but with exhaustion. They had seen too much to hate anyone anymore. "The war did not end for us that day," one said. "It ended slowly, every time we closed our eyes and saw the fire." Their testimonies gave the nameless dead their voices back, if only for a moment. In Neustadt, the local community refused to let the sea bury its secret. Teachers began bringing schoolchildren to the beach to tell them what had happened. Memorials multiplied, a stone obelisk overlooking the dunes, plaques inscribed in Polish, French, Russian, and Hebrew. The town declared the coastline a place of remembrance. Each year on May 3rd, at the hour the attack began, a siren sounds across the harbor. Boats stop in the water, and for 1 minute the bay returns to silence. It is the silence of prayer, not fear. The wreck itself still lies beneath the waves, preserved by the cold Baltic. Divers describe eerie corridors filled with silt and shadows, the remnants of a world trapped in its final moment. The ship that had once carried millionaires and later carried ghosts now carries history. The Cap Arcona became a monument in itself, a grave and a warning, its rusting hull reminding those who dive there how fragile truth can be when buried under orders and confusion. In 2020, 75 years after the sinking, survivors' families gathered again on the shore. Candles floated on the water, their reflections trembling like small souls. A local priest spoke only 12 words: they were freed from one hell and delivered into another. The wind carried those words out to sea, where the waves broke softly over the invisible tomb below. The story of the Cap Arcona is not one of heroes or villains, but of the terrible weight of war's final chaos. It is about what happens when humanity collapses under the noise of command and the silence of misunderstanding. The British did not mean to kill them, the Nazis did not mean to save them, and so they died, caught between two sides of a war that had already ended in spirit. Today, as ships pass over the coordinates where the Cap Arcona sank, few know what lies beneath. But sometimes, when the sea is calm and the light fades, fishermen say they can hear something faint, a low groan of steel, a whisper beneath the waves. Whether it's wind or memory, no one can say. But it reminds us that history does not rest quietly, and that even in peace, the dead still speak from the deep.